Now, the war in Ukraine has been going on for almost 3 years, but strangely, life has been going on and a new kind of normality has emerged despite everything that's been happening. And in this week's Reporter's Notebook, the Scottish journalist Jen Stout has been in the northern city of Kharkiv.
They do Christmas lights better than we do in Kharkiv, northeastern Ukraine. And the decorations were still up when I visited recently, brightening the winter wartime gloom. All through the park, the dark branches of trees were glowing with giant fairy lights, blue and red, gently illuminating the paths below, and a big tinsel tunnel for children to run through all the way down the main street. Of course, this is nothing compared to pre-war Kharkiv, when there were still 1.4 million people crowding this huge city, when the famous tree in Freedom Square drew visitors from all over Ukraine. It was somehow over 100 feet tall. Now the little stand-in tree is underground in a tube station where people can enjoy it away from the threat of ballistic missile or drone strike. And so too are the children. The city authorities have built underground schools as the war has dragged on. So why have Christmas lights at all, you might ask? Well, because the war is dragging on, because there are still many, many people here who want to enjoy some semblance of normality. And I was one of them for a week or so. Back in Kharkiv, the city that some 6 years ago first really sparked my love for Ukraine. I arrived just before the US changed presidents. At home, everyone was talking about Trump, and I'd been asked over and over what his return would mean for Ukraine's fight. I don't know, I invariably answered. I don't think anybody knows still. But then I got to Kharkiv and didn't bother with him for a whole week. Instead, there was poetry, art, theatre. There were long, deep discussions about everything else under the sun. I spent time learning more about the bewildering layers of architectural history around every corner in this historic city, from the oldest red brick merchant houses to glimpses of rare Ukrainian modern decoration similar to Art Deco, and to the discovery in a courtyard of a stunning Soviet-era mural etched into layers of coloured plaster. Sgraffito, the technique is called. I spent my time in reclaimed warehouses down by the River Lopan, where the city's relentlessly creative inhabitants have made new social spaces, new recording studios. There we celebrated the launch of my friend Ivana's extraordinary book of poetry. She's been writing all through the war, somehow finding time in between volunteering, fundraising for the army and launching new podcasts, and in between the daily grind of air raid sirens and explosions and worry. In her poems, I recognise places we visited together in the first year of the war. One described an evening by a reservoir in Donbass, looking across the water to the striped smokestacks of a power plant, watching skeins of geese fly overhead. Now those towering chimneys are gone, destroyed by the Russians and the whole place under their occupation. But the chimneys are there still, in Ivana's book. In another former warehouse, every seat in the new auditorium full, I watched a one-woman play, a piece of physical theatre. The performer's fluid motions were so perfectly in sync with the soundtrack that you almost moved along with her. It was about the reality of life in Kharkiv now, the strange absurdity it can involve. There was new art and sculpture at the Literary Museum that explored the same questions, imagining the battered city as a ship in a storm, the bomb shelters as the ship's hold, a place of dark safety from the world above. And this Literary Museum doesn't just preserve manuscripts and stage exhibitions, it runs a residency where writers can stay in the famous House of the Word building, which in the 1920s housed the city's novelists and playwrights and poets before the regime turned on them. Most were shot in the Russian Gulag. I was staying there in what had been the flat of Petro Lisovy, a writer and journalist murdered by Moscow's men in 1937. The building has enormous significance for many in Kharkiv and more broadly in Ukraine today. For those looking to the past to understand the present, to understand the patterns of Russian violence and Russian empire. Outside on Literatura Street, many windows were boarded up and facades shattered from previous bombardments. But in Lisovy's flat it was warm and cosy, and one night we invited people in for a book reading, my own this time. They call it a kvartirnik, a flat party, from the Soviet-era dissident tradition of gathering behind closed doors. Earnest young people, some clad in berets, packed in to sit on cushions on the floor, and we talked all evening about the limbo of wartime life, the ways in which we've all changed and haven't, and about love and food and hope, all the important things. But we did not talk about Trump.
That's Jen Stout with this week's Reporter's Notebook, talking about what's been happening in Ukraine, something like 3 years after the Russian invasion.